Hi guys, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the blues because the blues and jazz really have a very intertwined history and musical style. So it's really important that we go back a little bit and see some of the places that jazz came from through the blues. It's a pretty common thing to think that the blues and jazz are sort of parent and child, that the jazz came from the blues, when in reality this isn't quite accurate. In more ways than one, the blues and jazz are more like siblings. They come from a lot of the same places and they existed at the same time, but at one point they really diverged and became two different musical styles, speaking in technical musical terms. So today we're gonna stick to talking about the blues and its history, because it has a very rich history, but it's unfortunately one that's a little bit untraceable. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The first reason is that there wasn't really one single inventor or creator of the blues. It was more of a community effort, and it wasn't even really a community effort. It was sort of the effort of an entire race, and that race would be, of course, the Africans who were brought over as slaves to America. And the African American culture is very rich in itself, but as with a lot of different parts about African American culture, unfortunately it was a community that was relatively unseen by the rest of the nation, at least in terms of pop culture topics like music and art, and theater and literature and all of those things that make up a culture. So because other white members of society didn't really pay any attention to the ongoings of the African American slaves, there aren't really any physical records that would point towards a specific person or date about the inception of the blues or anything like that. So there's a little bit of guesswork here. There are some very hard facts that point musicologists towards the beginning of the blues, and the one very clear tie is to African musical traditions. So African music is based off of a pentatonic scale, which is a scale that includes only whole step notes. So that's the musical tradition that African slaves brought with them to America. But then they arrived in America, and around them was the musical tradition from Western styles of music, which are based on a diatonic scale, which is a scale that's made up of a whole note, whole steps, and half steps. So there was a little bit of tension and friction between the two scales, but we see pretty early on that African Americans worked towards blending the two scales together, and it's that blend of the pentatonic and the diatonic scales that it gives us the blue note. And from there we have the blues scale and the blue progression, and then a blues song. And so that really formed the basis for blues music. It also formed the basis for songs that slaves might sing out when they're working in the field. It formed the basis for spiritual songs that turned into gospel that you might hear today. It was based around, as I said before, it was based around the community. And that's one of the main things that separates the blues from jazz, is that the blues is the kind of music that doesn't require an elaborate band or a full orchestra or anything like that. In fact, it was more likely that if you had a guitar and you could play it, you sat down on a street corner, someone would walk over and start singing, maybe someone else would walk over and start playing on a box or another form of drum to give you some percussion, and there you go. You have a blues band right there on the corner of your street or in the center of your community, wherever you were. The heart of the blues is really in the emotions that those songs could convey. And that, I'm sure, is something that's very familiar to everybody today, is the term the blues. You know, if you walk around and you're feeling sad and you look sad, somebody's bound to walk up to you and say, oh, does somebody have the blues today? And so we have today sort of decided that the blues means when you're feeling a sad feeling or an unhappiness, something like that, which really makes the blues one of the most misused terms in the musical dictionary, as far as musicologists are concerned. Because if you look at the actual lyrics of blues songs from the past and from the present, there are a lot of other themes than just sadness. One theme that is sort of related, that's sort of an undercurrent of all blues songs, is struggle. There are a lot of struggles that everyone goes through every day, and there were a lot more struggles that African American slaves went through, and African American people went through even after slavery was abolished. And so there's a common feeling of being in a bad situation or having a bad day. A lot of blues songs were written in prison cells, and that was a pretty typical thing to do. So struggle and troubled times are maybe the basis of all blues songs, but then there are other aspects that we have to include. There's the idea of unrequited love and other kinds of love, not all of them sad, not all of them angry, sometimes maybe a little jealous, sometimes happy, but with a note of struggle. But then there are also a lot of songs about traveling, whether you were traveling back home after being away for a long time or going somewhere else that had a lot more opportunities for you. Those were pretty often found in a lot of blues songs. Another really popular theme was fate and destiny and the whims of fate and wherever the wind wanted to take you kind of thing. And sometimes it wasn't good and sometimes it wasn't that bad, and it really helped to broaden the scope of blues songs. But the final thing that really helped broaden that scope was women, actually. After a certain amount of time, female singers were considered the more typical blues singers, more typical than male singers, at least. And that had a profound impact on the theme of the blues. It took the blues from the country blues to what's known as classic blues. And while the country blues idiom has more to do with alienation and loneliness and desolation, once women took a hold of the blues music, it started to transform into the classic blues that we think of today, and it really started to add a different ethos to the modern blues lyric, and turn it into something a little lighter. There were a lot of women who actually started to make blues songs about sex and the different people that they were maybe sleeping with, and talking about how they weren't quite ready to settle down yet. And there were mixed reviews on those songs, but in general, that's sort of what the blues became. And that was a very important thing for the blues, and also an important stepping stone towards jazz. So that pretty much gives you an overview of the blues, the history of the blues. So now let's talk a little bit about the actual technical musical terms that musicians would use when they're playing the blues or talking about the blues. So I'm going to throw a lot of terms at you, but don't worry, we're gonna go through each one. In its most basic form, the blues is based off of what we call a 12 measure 1-4-5 form. So let's work with part by part. So the first part that I said was 12 measure. And for anyone who isn't familiar, a measure is a space of time, basically, where you can have as many number of beats as you want in a measure, and you can have as many number of any kind of beat as you want. So the most common form is what we call 4/4 time, or common time, and that's when you have 4 quarter notes in a measure. And that is going to sound something like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's 2 4/4 measures. So the blues is based off of 12 of those measures, usually in 4/4 time. The second part that I said, the 1-4-5 thing, has to do with the notes in the scale you're playing. So let's go with the most basic terms. So probably one of the most common scales or keys to play in is a C major scale. So this is what a C major scale sounds like. And when I say 1-4-5, I mean the first, fourth, and fifth notes of that scale. So these would be the first, fourth, and fifth notes of a C major scale. You have 1, 4, 5. And the 1-4-5 form has to do with basing all of your chords around those 4 root notes. So this would be the root note of the C major scale would be a C, and you would have chords based around that note, and then you would have chords based around the 4th note, and then chords based around the 5th note. So to put that in terms of the 12 measures, what we would say is that a blues song in the 1-4-5 form would have 4 measures based on the 1st note, followed by 2 measures based on the 4th note, followed by 2 more measures based on the 1st note, followed by 1 measure based on the 5th note, 1 measure based on the 4th note, and then 2 measures based on the 1st note. So that would sound a little bit something like this. So you would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And that is the most basic way that I can describe the 1-4-5 pattern of a blues song. But the way to really make it into a blues song, to turn it into something that we would recognize as the blues, is to add in different chords. And the chords upon which the blues rely heavily are what we call tonic, dominant, and subdominant chords. So let's go one by one. A tonic chord is a chord that we say includes the root of the key. And remember, I said before that the root of a C major key or scale is a C, so C is the root. So a tonic chord includes the root, but not the 4th note. So a tonic chord would sound like this. So you have your 4th, you have your 1st, you have your 3rd, and your 5th. So that's a tonic chord. Then we move on to the dominant chord, which does not include the root, but it does include the 4th. So this is what a dominant chord might sound like. So you have a 7th, a 4th, and a 5th. And the last chord that we talked about is the subdominant chord. And the subdominant chord includes both the root and the 4th. And that might sound something like this. So So you have your first, your fourth, and your sixth. So just to hear them side by side for comparison, this is what the 3 chords sound like. Again, tonic, subdominant, tonic, dominant, tonic. And those are very simple terms, simple forms of those chords. And putting all 3 of those together, the 12 bars, the 1-4-5, and the dominant, subdominant, and tonic chords is how we can create a typical blues riff. So I'm going to play something that might be what a classic blues song sounds like, just in general. Now, obviously, there's not going to be a blues song that sounds exactly like that. And one thing that's really important that was missing from that is lyrics. And lyrics are actually just as important to a blues song as the chord progression themselves, because the lyrics help you shape how the song is going to sound, whether it's going to be in a major key or a minor key, how long each measure is going to last, how long each 12-bar pattern is going to last. There are a lot of things that lyrics can do to mess with the structure, but this just gives you a very brief skeleton of the blues. So that about wraps it up for today. Thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.